Welcome back to the channel where we remember the women who once lit up the screen, the stage, and the hearts of millions. Today's video takes us through a deeply emotional journey as we honor American female celebrities whose lives were slowly taken by Alzheimer's disease. These women gave the world their talent, their energy, their light. But behind the applause and bright lights, they quietly battled a heartbreaking illness that slowly took away their memories, their words, and their sense of self. Some kept smiling through the confusion. Others faded from the public eye as the disease progressed. But all of them faced a painful road that too many know too well. They were more than entertainers. They were mothers, sisters, daughters, and fighters. Today, we remember their strength, their final days, and the lasting beauty they leave behind in a world they helped shape, even as their own slipped away piece by piece. Today, we remember Pat Summitt, one of the most iconic and respected figures in the history of American sports, whose life ended far too soon after a heartbreaking battle with early-onset Alzheimer's disease. Pat was just 59 when she was diagnosed, and though her spirit never wavered, the disease slowly began to take away the sharp mind and commanding presence that had once led her teams to historic victory after victory. In her final years, she lived in a senior facility in Knoxville, where she tried to stay active with hobbies like crocheting. But the memory loss and confusion worsened with time, eventually taking away her ability to do the very things that had once defined her. On June 28, 2016, just 2 weeks after her 64th birthday, Pat passed away peacefully, leaving behind a legacy that will never fade. Known for her fierce determination, piercing eyes, and unmatched drive, Pat Summitt coached the University of Tennessee Lady Vols from 1974 to 2012, collecting 1,098 career wins, the most in college basketball history at the time of her retirement, and leading her team to 8 NCAA championships without ever having a single losing season. She was more than a coach. She was a leader, a mentor, and a symbol of excellence. Born Patricia Sue Head on a dairy farm in Clarksville, Tennessee, she grew up tough and competitive, learning the game by battling her brothers on a hoop in their barn. Her passion for basketball carried her to the University of Tennessee at Martin, where she earned All-American honors before going on to win an Olympic silver medal as a player and later a gold medal as the coach of the U.S. women's basketball team in 1984. Her influence reached far beyond the court. She received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, was inducted into multiple halls of fame, and inspired countless young women to chase their dreams with grit and grace. Even after her diagnosis, Pat chose to fight not just for herself, but for others. She launched the Pat Summitt Foundation to raise money for Alzheimer's research and care, hoping that her struggle might one day lead to a cure. Her son Tyler, who stood by her side until the end, said she died peacefully after a fierce fight, and her legacy continues through the Pat Summitt Alzheimer's Clinic and the lives of every player, coach, and fan she touched. Pat Summitt's death was not just the loss of a sports legend, it was the loss of a strong, brave woman who never gave up, even when her own mind betrayed her. Rita Hayworth, the dazzling star whose beauty lit up Hollywood in the 1940s, but whose final years were marked by a quiet, heartbreaking battle. In 1980, after years of confusion, mood swings, and public moments of distress that many mistook for alcoholism, Rita was finally diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's disease, a cruel illness that slowly stole her memory, her grace, and eventually her life. Her daughter Yasmin, who stood by her side until the end, became her caregiver as the disease progressed, watching her mother fade into a shell of the woman the world once adored. Rita slipped into a semi-coma in February 1987 and passed away on May 14th at the age of 68 in her Manhattan apartment, no longer able to recognize even those she once loved most. It was a deeply sad end for someone whose face had once been the dream of soldiers during World War II, whose smile had lit up screens across the globe. Born Margarita Carmen Cancino in 1918 to a Spanish father and American mother, Rita was pushed into dance from the time she could stand, performing as a child and later becoming one half of a nightclub act with her father, who, behind the scenes, was abusing her, a dark secret that haunted her for life. Changing her name and her look for Hollywood, Rita became a screen goddess, with unforgettable roles in Gilda and The Lady from Shanghai. She was once the most famous pinup girl in the world, the face of glamour, and a dancer even Fred Astaire admired. But behind the image were years of pain, abusive relationships, failed marriages, deep loneliness, and a mind quietly unraveling. Her illness not only took her away from us too soon, but also helped bring attention to a disease that, until then, had been mostly ignored. Rita died with her daughter holding her hand, no longer the love goddess, but a fragile soul finally at rest after a life filled with light, darkness, fame, and heartbreak. Dorian Leigh, a woman whose name once echoed across the fashion world as one of the first true supermodels, but who in the end faced a quiet and painful decline far from the flashing lights that once adored her. She passed away on July 7, 2008, at the age of 91, in a nursing home in Falls Church, Virginia, after a long struggle with Alzheimer's disease, a cruel condition that slowly stripped away her sharp mind, vivid memories, and sense of self. In her final days, the woman who had once commanded attention on over 50 magazine covers and dazzled in Revlon's iconic Fire and Ice campaign was no longer the vibrant face of glamour, but a fading soul in a quiet room, remembered more by her family than by the cameras she once captivated. Born Dorian Elizabeth Lee Parker on April 23, 1917, in San Antonio, Texas, she was the oldest of 4 daughters and grew up in a family full of contradictions. A brilliant chemist father who invented etching acid, and a Scottish-descended mother whose striking beauty ran through her daughters like blood. Dorian's path to stardom was anything but typical. Before modeling, she had already lived several lives, as a teenage bride, a mother, a divorcee, and even a mechanical engineer who designed airplane wings during World War II. Her early life was a mixture of brains, boldness, and bad luck. She worked in male-dominated jobs, only to quit when promotions never came because she was a woman. It was only when she turned to modeling at the supposedly too old age of 27 that her life took a dramatic turn. She lied about her age to land her first cover for Harper's Bazaar in 1944, and from there, she soared. Dorian wasn't just a pretty face. She had a fierce sense of business, a sharp wit, and a rebellious spirit. She refused to be just someone's trophy, choosing instead to support herself and sometimes even the men in her life. She married and divorced 4 times, lost a son to suicide, and eventually moved from magazine covers to running restaurants and writing cookbooks. Her life was full of passion, heartache, reinvention, and tragedy. Alzheimer's didn't just take her memory. It slowly stole the fire that once made her unforgettable. And yet, even as her mind slipped away, the legacy of who she was remained. A woman who reshaped beauty standards, helped define what it meant to be a model, and lived with a kind of reckless honesty that made her unforgettable. She died not as the cover girl the world once knew, but as a mother, a sister, and a woman who had lived through nearly a century of change, loss, and glory. Dorian Leigh's story isn't just about beauty or fame. It's about a woman who never followed the rules, who kept pushing forward no matter how many times life tried to stop her, and who, in the end, left behind a world that still remembers her face, even if she couldn't remember it herself. Imogene Coca, a one-of-a-kind American comic and actress whose legacy spanned vaudeville stages, Broadway theaters, nightclubs, and television screens across generations. Imogene passed away on June 2, 2001, at the age of 92, quietly in her Fairfield County home, after suffering from complications related to Alzheimer's disease. It was a gentle end for a woman who had spent her entire life bringing joy to others, but also a deeply emotional one, as Alzheimer's slowly took away her memories, the very essence of a performer's soul. Her final years were private, with her career behind her and her loved ones gone. Her second husband, actor King Donovan, had died years earlier in 1987. It was a quiet, slow goodbye for someone who once made the entire nation roar with laughter every Saturday night. Imogene's journey began in Philadelphia, born to a violinist father and a dancer mother, raised in a home filled with music, performance, and the spirit of vaudeville. She started performing before she was even old enough to drive, landing her first Broadway job at just 16. She mixed comedy, music, and dance into something that no one had seen before, goofy, clever, full of heart, and people loved her for it. Her big break came in the early 1950s when she starred opposite Sid Caesar on Your Show of Shows, one of the most important comedy programs in early television. She became a household name with her expressive, flexible face and quiet wit winning over millions. That show earned her 5 Emmy nominations, including 1 win and even a rare Peabody Award. Her talent stretched far beyond television. She was a Broadway star, a nightclub performer, a voice actress, and a comedian respected by legends like Carol Burnett and Lily Tomlin. But her life wasn't without hardship. In 1972, a car accident left her blind in one eye. But even then, she returned to the stage with grace and strength. She suffered the tragic deaths of both her mother and first husband just a month apart, and still kept going. Her final big role was in On the 20th Century, a musical where she stunned audiences and earned a Tony nomination. Even in her 80s, she was working, sitting in freezing snow for a music video shoot without a single complaint. That was the kind of woman she was: humble, funny, brave, and never one to quit. But Alzheimer's is cruel. It takes the sharp mind and quick wit that defined her and slowly fades it all away. Though her passing was from natural causes, it was Alzheimer's that robbed her of her last years. Still, Imogene Coca will always be remembered not for how she died, but for how she lived, full of energy, full of humor, and full of soul. She didn't just perform. She lit up every room she entered. Her legacy isn't just in awards or film credits. It's in every person she made laugh, every young comedian she inspired, and every memory she gave to American television history. Arlene Francis, a bright, sharp, and endlessly charming woman whose voice and smile became a part of millions of homes for decades, but whose final years were marked by heartbreaking silence and decline. Arlene passed away on May 31, 2001, at the age of 93, after suffering from both Alzheimer's disease and cancer. She spent her last years in a nursing home in San Francisco, far from the studios and bright lights where she once thrived, her mind slowly slipping away while her loved ones watched the vibrant woman they knew fade into someone quiet and confused. Her son Peter was by her side when she died, saying goodbye to a mother who had once been so full of life, laughter, and wit. Arlene was born Arlene Francis Kazanjian on October 20, 1907, in Boston to Armenian immigrant parents. Her father had escaped the horrors of the Hamidian massacres and came to America to start over as a portrait photographer. When Arlene was just 7, the family moved to New York, where her love for the stage began to grow. Though her strict father tried to steer her away from acting by setting her up with a boutique, Arlene followed her own path. She started in radio, where her natural voice and warm personality landed her countless roles. By the 1930s, she was working with Orson Welles and appearing in Broadway plays, but it was television that made her a star. Arlene became a household name through What's My Line, the iconic game show where she was a regular panelist for 25 years, from 1950 to 1975. Viewers loved her elegant charm, her heart-shaped diamond pendant, and the way she seemed to always know just what to ask. She wasn't just smart, she was funny, graceful, and real. She also made history as the first woman to host a television game show, leading Blind Date in the early days of TV. But her life wasn't without tragedy. In 1960, while she was away, a dumbbell from her apartment accidentally fell and killed a man on the street, a burden she carried for years. In 1963, she was in a terrible car crash that left one person dead and Arlene badly injured. Through it all, she stayed on camera, never letting the pain show. She was married twice, the second time to actor Martin Gable, her great love and partner until his death in 1986. They had one son, Peter, who would later help care for her in her final years. Alzheimer's crept in slowly during the 1990s. The woman who once hosted daily radio shows, joked with celebrities, and dazzled Broadway audiences began to forget names, then places, then everything. It's almost unbearable to think about someone like Arlene, so full of life, stories, and memory, losing all of that piece by piece. She died quietly, But the sadness of her final chapter only makes her legacy feel more fragile and precious. Arlene Francis wasn't just a TV personality. She was a trailblazer, a voice of warmth during uncertain times, and a woman who brought grace and laughter to generations. Her death was slow and painful, the cruel kind that steals a person before it actually takes them. But her life, her career, and her spirit remain unforgettable. Estelle Getty, the beloved American actress and comedian who became a household name for her unforgettable role as Sophia Petrillo on The Golden Girls, and whose life ended in a heartbreaking battle with dementia with Lewy bodies just 3 days before her 85th birthday. In her final years, Estelle's vibrant mind slowly faded away, a devastating decline for a woman once so sharp and full of wit. Her family shared that the disease progressed to the point where she could no longer speak with friends, recognize loved ones, or even remember the very lines she had once delivered so flawlessly. She passed away peacefully in her sleep on July 22, 2008, at her home in Los Angeles, surrounded by the people who loved her. It was a quiet end for someone whose voice had once brought laughter to millions. Long before the fame, Estelle was born Estelle Schur in New York City in 1923 to Polish Jewish immigrants, and her childhood on the Lower East Side was filled with the simple joy of Friday night vaudeville shows with her family. It was during one of those outings that she first felt the spark to perform. Life wasn't easy, and her path to acting was far from smooth. She worked as a secretary to pay the bills while chasing auditions and raising her 2 sons. For decades, her talent went unnoticed until her breakout stage role in Torch Song Trilogy in her late 50s finally put her on the map. Then came The Golden Girls in 1985, and with it, Sophia Petrillo, the quick-tongued, brutally honest, and deeply loving matriarch who stole every scene and became an icon. It's hard to imagine now, but Estelle was actually younger than Bea Arthur, the actress who played her daughter, and she had to rely on makeup and wigs to look older. She won a Primetime Emmy and a Golden Globe for that role, but more than the awards, she won hearts. Even as her memory began to fade during the later seasons, she fought to stay on screen, sometimes needing cue cards to get through scenes. Behind the laughter, there was a woman who carried personal pain. She lost friends and family to AIDS, including her nephew, and she became a quiet but committed activist, helping care for those affected when many others turned away. Off-screen, she was a devoted wife to Arthur Gettleman, whom she married in 1947 and whose last name she used as her stage name. They spent time living apart when work called her to California, but their bond lasted until his death in 2004. Estelle's passing marked the end of a remarkable life, not just because she made us laugh, but because she fought for everything she had. She was a late bloomer in an industry obsessed with youth, a petite woman who carried enormous strength, and a performer who showed the world that older women had stories worth telling. She now rests at Hollywood Forever Cemetery, her gravestone marked with the words, "With love and laughter." Estelle Getty didn't just play a mother on screen. She felt like one to all of us, and her loss still leaves a quiet ache. Geraldine Fitzgerald, the Irish actress whose long and remarkable life in film, theater, and television ended in deep sadness on July 17, 2005, when she passed away at the age of 91 in her Manhattan home after battling Alzheimer's disease for nearly 10 painful years. What ultimately took her life was a respiratory infection that struck while her body was already weakened by the long, slow decline of her mind. It's heartbreaking to think of someone so full of life and talent spending her final years unable to remember the art she gave so much to, the people she loved, or even who she was. Geraldine's story is one of early promise, major success, fading stardom, and an inspiring second act that speaks volumes about her strength. She was born in Dublin in 1913, raised in a household split between Catholic and Protestant traditions, and discovered acting thanks to her aunt, actress Shella Richards. After studying painting, she chose to follow the stage instead and began acting in 1932 at the Gate Theatre. Her sharp beauty and emotional depth soon caught attention, and by the late 1930s, she had moved to London, and then to New York, where she worked with Orson Welles and landed her big break in Hollywood. She earned an Academy Award nomination for her haunting role as Isabella Linton in Wuthering Heights 1939. acted in hits like Dark Victory, Watch on the Rhine, and Wilson, and shared the screen with legends like Bette Davis and Laurence Olivier. But her time in Hollywood wasn't always kind. Despite her talent, she was often given roles that didn't match her ability, and battles with studio heads dimmed her film career. She never gave up, though. She found her way back to the stage and proved her brilliance again and again. Whether as Mary Tyrone in Long Day's Journey into Night, as a cabaret performer singing Irish street songs, or even as a trailblazing director on Broadway, earning a Tony nomination for Mass Appeal in 1981. She balanced all this with motherhood, raising a son, Michael Lindsay Hogg, who would go on to be a respected director himself, and a daughter, Susan, with her second husband, businessman Stuart Sheftel. Her life wasn't without gossip. Rumors swirled that Orson Welles was her son's real father, but Geraldine never confirmed it. What's certain is that she gave everything she had to the world of performance and never let disappointment stop her. In her later years, Alzheimer's robbed her of her memories, her independence, and her spark. And it's especially tragic that this gifted woman, who once played the mother of an Alzheimer's patient in a movie, ended up living that same devastating experience in real life. She was buried beside her beloved husband in Woodlawn Cemetery, leaving behind a legacy that deserves to be remembered with respect and deep emotion. Geraldine Fitzgerald wasn't just an actress. She was a fighter, a creator, and a woman who shone in every corner of the stage and screen until the very end. Irene Papas, a legendary Greek actress and singer whose powerful presence on screen and on stage left a deep mark on the world, but whose final years were marked by silence and sorrow. Irene passed away on September 14, 2022, at the age of 93, after battling Alzheimer's disease for nearly a decade. The once fiery, commanding woman who brought ancient heroines to life faded slowly into a quiet, heartbreaking decline, cared for in her niece's home in Kifisha, far from the bright lights she once commanded. Her death wasn't sudden, but it was painful in its own way. A slow goodbye that began years earlier when the disease started erasing her memory, her voice, her identity. It's devastating to imagine someone so full of strength, so full of fire, being robbed piece by something so cruel. Irene was born Irene Lelikou in a small Greek village called Kiliamodi on September 3, 1929. Her father taught drama, and it was clear from a young age that acting flowed through her blood. She moved to Athens as a child, and by 15 was enrolled in drama school, though she hated its rigid style and pushed back against it. She had a voice that could shake you to your core, and a face that carried the weight of tragedy like it was carved in marble. She began her career in the late 1940s, and over 5 decades starred in more than 70 films. Hollywood noticed her too. She lit up the screen in The Guns of Navarone, Zorba the Greek, and Z. But her greatest triumphs came in classical roles like Electra, Antigone, and Helen of Troy. Critics said watching her was like seeing Greek mythology breathe. Her performances were filled with raw grief, power, and resistance, and she never faked a moment of it. In real life, she was just as fearless. When the Greek military junta took over in 1967, she stood up against it and went into exile, refusing to be part of a country silencing its artists. She spent time in Italy and New York, but her heart never left Greece. In love, she carried secrets. Her brief early marriage didn't last, but she spoke openly later about her deep and lasting love for Marlon Brando, calling him the great passion of her life. As time went on, Irene took on smaller roles, but always brought dignity and truth to the screen. She sang, too, with a haunting voice that gave life to the songs of Vangelis and Mikis Theodorakis. But then came the illness. In 2013, it was announced that Irene had Alzheimer's. It's hard to imagine that towering voice being silenced, her memories slipping away. The woman who once moved audiences with a single look was now slowly fading away from the world. She spent her last years in quiet care, far from the cameras, and passed away surrounded by loved ones in the place she had once called home. She was buried in her village, the same soil where she first dreamed of becoming someone. Irene Papas wasn't just an actress. She was history, tragedy, resistance, and beauty all at once. Her death was slow and cruel, but her legacy remains fierce and unforgettable. Iris Murdoch, a brilliant novelist and philosopher whose life ended in heartbreaking decline after a long and painful struggle with Alzheimer's disease, a cruel illness that slowly took away her memory, her words, and eventually her voice as a writer. She passed away on February 8, 1999, at the age of 79, after spending her final years in quiet confusion, no longer able to recognize the people she loved or recall the stories she once so beautifully created. The disease had crept in silently in the early 1990s, gradually erasing the mind that had given the world more than 24 novels and countless insights into the human soul. Once known for her sharp intellect and endless curiosity, Iris began forgetting the names of her characters, losing track of her plots, and then, eventually, struggling to speak or write at all. Her husband, John Bailey, whom she had been married to for over 40 years, stood by her side through it all, watching as the vibrant, thoughtful woman he adored faded into someone lost and quiet. Born in Dublin on July 15, 1919, Iris was the only child of a civil servant father and a mother who had given up dreams of being a singer. Though the family moved to London when she was a baby, Ireland stayed close to her heart for the rest of her life. Educated at Oxford and later Cambridge, Iris was deeply influenced by philosophy, especially by thinkers like Wittgenstein. Her early years were filled with war work, helping refugees after WWII, and her writing career began with her 1954 novel Under the Net, which was later recognized as one of the century's best. Over the decades, she would write masterpieces like The Bell, The Black Prince, and The Sea, which won the Booker Prize in 1978. She explored deep, sometimes dark parts of human nature, love, desire, goodness, selfishness, and created characters who were flawed, real, and unforgettable. She was honored with many awards, including being made a Dame by Queen Elizabeth II in 1987, and her impact was felt far beyond Britain, as her books found readers across the world. Her marriage to Bailey was unusual, but filled with affection, even as she had relationships with others, including both men and women. Her life was never about simple rules, it was about honesty, creativity, and facing life with courage. In her later years, when the dementia took over, she could no longer write, but the dignity and love in her life remained, especially in how Bailey cared for her until her last breath. Her story is one of genius and deep humanity, and her death, though expected, was still a terrible loss, not just for literature, but for everyone who believes in the power of words to explain who we are.